If you could deliver a message to President Trump now, directly, for one thing for him to do today, what would it be?
To help put an end to the Lebanese conflict. And I would like to reaffirm to President Trump our readiness to enter into immediate negotiations with Israel. We know, that this conflict can only end with negotiations. The U.S., is a strategic partner to Lebanon, and President Trump, more than anyone else, can play a decisive role in bringing, this war to an end. So we call on a greater engagement of the U.S. All Lebanese, they are victims. This war has been imposed on us. We didn't seek it. We didn't choose it, and now our main objective is how to end it.
Dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers, welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I'm here with my co-host Seamus Malekafzeli, along with our producer M. Siniza. We are recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying, but so far from dead.
We are now several days out from the start of what the IDF called Operation Eternal Darkness. That is legitimately the actual name of the operation they launched against Lebanon. When the temporary ceasefire was announced with Iran, the understanding was, and this was illustrated in the Pakistani Prime Minister's own statement, was that Lebanon was included in the ceasefire. Israel then claimed in the morning, with a very violent show of force, which killed more than 300 people now, at least according to the latest estimates from the Lebanese Civil Defense, that Lebanon was not included in the ceasefire and that it would require a separate ceasefire, or better yet, the complete dissolution of Hezbollah as a force, both political and military. Lebanon has been under Israeli bombardment for not just this period of time, but for more than 15 months since the ceasefire that was achieved back in November 2024. And Hezbollah's re-entrance into the war came as a surprise to many and has embroiled the Israeli north back into the maelstrom of conflict. We discussed this a little bit in our discussion with Dr. Karim Makdisi, who we're very happy to get on. But we didn't really get to discuss, we discussed this a little bit in News of the Week, but the entrance of Hezbollah into this war, how has it surprised you?
Well, I think like many people, I was under the impression that Hezbollah was pretty severely damaged by the 2024 war and was in a period of rebuilding, which they clearly were. But I anticipated that they would take more of a back seat in this conflict. I don't think it surprised me that they entered at all. But I think like many, I was anticipating that Ansar Allah, the more gung-ho member of the Axis of Resistance coalition that has proved capable of withstanding U.S. and Israeli strikes, in part because of their geographic distance from Israel. I anticipated that they would jump in first, but they didn't. Hezbollah jumped in within a couple of days. And I think it indicates, A, that Hezbollah is stronger than we realized, that they were not just rebuilding from their losses, but also re-strategizing. But I think it also signals that they wanted to, on some level, A, support Iran, but B, take advantage of the chaos of the situation to renegotiate their own settlement, their own deal, because that deal really was unsustainable. As you said, the ceasefire that was entered into 2024, it wasn't really a ceasefire. Israel maintained, albeit at a much lower level, it maintained its strikes on southern Lebanon. And so I was initially surprised, but then, once the war proceeded, I began to read Hezbollah's entry as an attempt to renegotiate their own arrangement, both with the Israeli state and with Israel. But I also read it as both Iran and Hezbollah learning from some of the mistakes of 2024 and even into 2025, namely that the unity of fronts, and we've talked about this on the show, is so critical for the success of resistance to the U.S.-Israeli project, because the U.S. and Israel have demonstrated so clearly over the past 3 or so years that their strategy is effective when they can pick off resistance groups one by one, deal with Hamas separately from dealing with Ansar Allah, separately from dealing with Hezbollah, separately from dealing with Iran. And we have seen Iran and also the broader axis pivot more towards unity. And I think that's why that's such a crucial key component of these ceasefire negotiations, both in the demands that the Iranians are making or were making in Islamabad, and also potentially the poison pill of Lebanon's inclusion into the ceasefire.
No, we talked very briefly about the ceasefire negotiations on the last News of the Week. And when Vance talked about the failure of the negotiations, he talked exclusively about how Iran refused to, not commit to a nuclear weapon, which is insane. That's what they've always said. Clearly, it was not just about uranium enrichment, but also the stopping of the war of all fronts. That was also a sticking point. America was completely unable to back down from its very maximalist position. And Iran, holding many cards, also is not willing to back down from this, mainly because they know that if they back down from this, that they are right back in the position they were before, in which Israel is going to come back for more. America is going to come back for more because it did not cause them very much economic cost. We're going to get into the conversation a little bit, but I just want to briefly say that we're recording this about 30 minutes after the Strait of Hormuz blockade has started. Not the Iranian one, but an American one. I really didn't get this one. I didn't expect this one. I'm going to be honest with you. I had anticipated that there would be some sort of blockade maybe in the future of just Iranian ships, because that's what a normal country would do. But apparently they're going to try to force Iran's hand on this matter by not only blocking Iranian ships, but any ship that does not try to go through a sea of naval mines and takes a toll from the Iranians for safe passage.
Yeah.
So it's really something that America is willing to go along with this. The primary sticking point that Lebanon is not involved in this deal, that America is willing to detonate the world economy rather than restrain Israel from bombarding southern Lebanon and Beirut. They seem to have some sort of temporary pause there. Get ready for oil to hit not only $200, but as Matthew Petty predicted, maybe $500.
Another friend of the show, Hassan, said that we're heading to a gift and barter economy, not even just a priced oil.
No. I think if you want the guys, if you stock up on enough walnuts and enough dates, you could probably buy a house.
Yeah.
No more credit checks. Those are going away. No, we're going to take on not only Lebanon, but apparently the entirety of the world economy and the Pope, simply because Israel cannot be restrained from doing this. And I'm hoping that everybody is really okay with that.
Part of the deal, baby.
Part of the deal. And talk about all of this. We were very happy to speak with Dr. Karim Makdisi. He is an associate professor of political studies at the American University of Beirut, my former alma mater, quasi-alma mater, and we had a great conversation with him.
He is also the host of the Makdisi Street podcast.
The illustrious Makdisi Street podcast, I should say. That is a podcast I do, one of the very few I do actually actively listen to. And for anyone who knows me and how much I hate podcasts as a genre, the fact that I do this is a testament to its quality and the idea that Dylan presented me with, and also the fact that Makdisi Street is an excellent podcast as well. Before we get into the conversation, we do have a pitch to you, the listener. Turbulence is entirely listener funded. We don't run ads. We don't take money from institutions. And that independence is the foundation of this project. It only exists because of you.
Because we're committed to providing you the in-depth history and present context you need to make sense of each of these topics, these episodes take a great deal of time and effort to produce, from conception to research to editing. It's because we value your time as a listener and because we want to produce something lasting and useful that we think this level of effort is worth investing in. But that means we can't quite move as nimbly as we might otherwise like. So in addition to our free public episodes, we're also dropping weekly episodes behind the paywall. That's where we'll be able to respond to events as they unfold in closer to real time, providing our analysis, following up on threads and conversations from prior episodes, and drawing connections across the topics we've covered.
To do all this, we need your support. A $5 monthly subscription will give you access to the bonus feed, our Substack community, and most importantly, you'll make it possible for us to keep doing this work independently week after week. Subscribe today at turbulencepod.substack.com and follow along on Twitter and Instagram at turbulence_pod. We hope you'll join us. Right, we are speaking today with Dr. Karim Makdisi. He is an associate professor of political studies and international relations at the American University of Beirut, and he joins us from Lebanon. Doctor, good morning.
Good morning.
So I have been seeing things that friends back in Beirut have been posting, things they've been saying, speaking with them, and I'm wondering if you could just illustrate for folks outside of Beirut, outside of Lebanon, what the capital was like when Operation Eternal Darkness was launched, and how different that was in contrast to how Beirut, the city itself, outside of Dahia, the southern suburbs, how that has been since the start of this war.
Well, let me start with what happened last Wednesday. It really, I can say, and I've spoken to a lot of people just to kind of validate, in a sense, what I felt and what my family felt, which is that it was an incredibly difficult moment. I mean, it was scary. I mean, let's be honest, it was extremely scary, very frightening. We had a couple of missiles that landed very close to us. In fact, here I'm in Ras Beirut. I'm in, near the American University of Beirut. We had a couple of missiles that landed very close to us, and a couple of others that are kind of along the route that we would normally walk, to. And then, quickly hearing that there were all these attacks across the city. It's one of these things where you're walking around and you think that at any moment you could die. Maybe there was going to be another round of attacks immediately following it. You could feel the fear. You could feel it was a clear attempt. And I think the word that comes through is to terrorize. I mean, it was a pure terrorist attack in every sense of the word. It seems clear, and no matter what they say or some of their apologists say, there was no real targets. There was an attempt to basically say that the Israelis refuse the ceasefire, at least with Lebanon, as after Trump had announced the ceasefire without consulting Netanyahu and the Israelis. So this was their way to emphatically to perform this notion that they refused to have a ceasefire with Lebanon, and to try to increase the ante and make this notion that Hezbollah is hiding among the non-Shia communities across Beirut. So not just the Dahi, the ghetto of the Dahi, where it's okay, it's the Shia area, so it's okay to hit them. People have gotten used to that. A lot of it, in truth, has been emptied, but it's, continues to be hit. It's not the South where somehow, over years, not decades, let alone these last couple of years, people have kind of gotten used to, in Beirut, have gotten used to the idea that the South it's almost a different area. This is an attempt to say, and they've done it several times, but not in this one massive, episode, let's say, to try to tell everybody that you're all within the zone. Like, we can get any of you. And we can get any of you if you're hiding anybody, if you are anywhere near a displaced person, if we're near anybody that we deem to be somebody that we want to get, or a family member of somebody we want to get, or the family member of a friend of a family member that we need to get. So basically anybody. So that was their way to make this huge performance. And they succeeded in terrorizing a population for that period, I would say. I really, if you want to make a comparison, I would say there is a comparison to be made with the port explosion of 2020, in the way, at least those that were in the city, this kind of massive explosion that people still talk about. I think people are going to be talking about this day for years to come. So in that sense, yes, I think it was a really incredible moment.
Yeah. Yeah, it did really feel like Israel attempting to reassert power control, especially over the narrative in the face of a ceasefire that seemed to happen without their participation or consent.
Can I also add, I think it's interesting to know from the beginning, and probably we may discuss it more, that one main goal, I think, was to try to signal, to perform that they won't accept the ceasefire and to terrorize people and to tell everybody that everybody's part of this battle. I think it's also a mark, it's like a temper tantrum. It's a mark of frustration that in terms of their strategy, they were unable to achieve, just as the Americans were unable to achieve in Iran. The Israelis, so far, in any case, have been unable to achieve their main objectives in Lebanon.
Yeah.
To kind of, in the way that if you're really losing, you lash out in this kind of way.
Yeah. No, I certainly want to return to Israeli objectives, I think probably later in the conversation. But I did want to ask about Hezbollah's entry into this war, because when this war began, or at least this iteration, this escalation of the broader, longer war that has engulfed the region since October 7th. But when it began on February 28th with the US-Israeli strikes on Iran, many of us anticipated that Ansar Allah in Yemen would be the first member of the axis of resistance to come to Iran's aid. Hezbollah has long been Iran's strongest regional ally in terms of military power, but it had been extremely quiet since the quote-unquote ceasefire it entered into with Israel following the war in 2024. It was unclear what kind of fighting form they were in. So it was actually quite surprising, I think, for many of us to see Hezbollah enter so soon, and especially given how fragile things have been in Lebanon. How do you understand what their strategic calculus was?
Yeah, it is interesting. And I think anybody who says that they could predict what Hezbollah ended up coming up with, in other words, they surprised everybody. Clearly, they surprised the Israelis and the Americans. They certainly surprised everybody in Lebanon. I think they surprised their own community, their own kind of staunch supporters. I don't think there's anybody that predicted this or understood it. Maybe there's certainly some were saying, they were not as badly hit, or they're not in that kind of surrender mode that some were pushing very strongly. But certainly, they wouldn't have expected the Hezbollah to be as prepared as clearly as they are now, and have they been over the past few weeks. So I think that's important we don't know. What we do know is that they clearly spent the last 14, 15 months before this escalation of war. They didn't start the war, it was an escalation of the war. They laid low. They were not making big speeches or doing big movements. They were actually cooperating with the Lebanese army south of the Litani, as part of the disarming campaign that was taking place. And there was quite a bit of that. Disarming, not so much disarming, but removing weapons from the south, north. And otherwise, hitting certain things and blowing up some, giving up some of the weapons and some of the storage sites and some of the tunnels and things like this. And that was genuine. That did happen. So the Lebanese, but they were cooperating with the Lebanese army in that respect. So on the face of it, they were going along with what they had agreed to in the ceasefire as far as south of the Litani was concerned. And in the meantime, they were preparing, as we now know, for this battle that has now commenced with a clear understanding. And I think that's something that myself and probably others were thinking, that there was always going to be another war. Either the Israelis were going to enter in, if Hezbollah were as defeated as they were claiming, they were going to come in and sweep up, so to speak, or something else. But there had to be some kind of resolution in that kind of way. The fact that they had been laying so low, the fact that they had been playing the defeated army or the defeated armed force, I think is a testament to the way in which they've rebuilt. So clearly they've pared down, clearly they've changed the way in which they're operating, and they're, institutionally, bureaucratically, administratively, that very bloated institution that they had after the 2006 war, which grew up until 2024. That, I think, has been really reduced considerably. The decentralization of the command structure, the way in which Naim Qassem and the others are kind of operating. All of this, I think, is clearly been very, very effectively rebuilt and redone and reimagined and reconstructed. The bringing in of the weapons, after Bashar al-Assad fell, there was a lot of the Syrian army kind of weapons that were transferred into Lebanon. So I think there was a rearming process, there was a re-strategizing process, and there was a clear attempt to kind of remove a lot of the surveillance and a lot of the moles that had clearly become very established in the prior kind of iteration under the latter years of Hassan Nasrallah before he was assassinated. So I think all of this took place. They were, I think, trying to manage, on the one hand, politically accepting a narrative of defeat, although they were pushing back at it politically, obviously, but sort of taking it on the chin as much as possible. But on the other hand, building up, knowing that there was going to be this other war, and knowing that if they had pushed back and had acted without being wise about it or strategic about it, they would have not been prepared for this war. So they've done a job which I don't think anybody foresaw, and they've managed so far. I mean, I don't know what happens from now on, but up until now, they've managed to thwart the Israeli kind of strategic objectives in Lebanon. And I think the reason you made a very interesting point that, one might have thought that the Yemenis or the Houthis would have started before Hezbollah, but we know a couple of things. First, we know that the Israelis had made a decision that they were going to come into Lebanon. And so that was intercepted. And so I think Hezbollah decided to start while they were prepared rather than wait for the Israelis to kind of really finalize their preparations and come in. And on the other hand, I think from an Iranian strategic point of view, I think they wanted to keep the Yemenis and the Houthis back a little bit for a different round. Because there you have Bab el-Mandeb. It's more on the kind of larger strategic Gulf and kind of world economy shipping lanes. That's what would be most useful from the Houthis rather than them sending missiles to the Israelis, So I think the Iranians have kind of thought this through very, very clearly. And as you see, they still haven't really been involved. And I think we're going to see now that if these negotiations really fail and we end up going back, or the Iranians end up going back to full war with the Israelis and the Americans, I think you're going to find the Yemeni and the Houthi card being played, and not only the Straits of Hormuz, but the Bab el-Mandeb also coming into play.
You mentioned the reorientation of Hezbollah away from a kind of more centralized bureaucratic structure. And that's something that I've been thinking about with respect to the Iranians. And it does feel like there have been certain lessons learned since 2024. I mean, perhaps that's lessons learned from a decades-long trajectory of Hezbollah in Lebanon moving kind of away from the traditional structure of a resistance group towards a more centralized, something that resembles more of a conventional military force. And that didn't really work out very well. It seemed like there was, certain exposures on the level of intelligence. But what we've seen from Hezbollah now, it seems, and from the Iranians is a shift back away from that centralization towards a more decentralized structure that feels like it is more capable of responding in real time and not facing the kind of decision paralysis or, lack of flexibility that we saw in 2024. So it's just interesting to see those shifts on the military level and to see them also across theaters within the broader axis of resistance.
I think the lessons learned from 2024, so that battle from 23 till 24 to the ceasefire in Lebanon case, at least until the ceasefire in 2024, the ability of the Hezb to have learned the lessons, A, and then B, enacted them from, let's say throughout 2025 and now 2026 until this war escalated, really is pretty extraordinary, especially if you consider the kind of domestic pressure they've been under, both the fact that their own constituencies has been really badly damaged, a lot of them displaced, a lot of the villages were destroyed. And with Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah having been killed and the status that Nasrallah played in the Shia community and really in the national, as a country as a whole, the Iranians as well from the 12-day war have learned a lot. And they've learned that they can't anymore play this game where they try to isolate and try to just do just enough and kind of try to be cautious. And so ironically, I think the assassination of Ali Khamenei and some of this older command structure, which is the equivalent of the decapitation that they did with Nasrallah and the older commanders in Hezbollah, has now kind of created a new set of leaderships that is much less willing to be cautious strategically and cautious diplomatically and sort of just give the Americans and the Israelis what they want for a ceasefire now, and then hoping that, okay, these guys will actually implement the ceasefire. I think everybody in the world, let alone the Iranians and people here, understand that the Israelis simply will never, ever comply with any law, any international law, local law, domestic law, ceasefire, whatever you want to call them, they simply won't. And America has become like the Israelis in that sense. So something has to change strategically for there to be some kind of longer term agreement rather than yet another ceasefire and then 6 months down the line there's another war.
The comparison that I've been thinking a lot about is everybody kind of catching up to the Yemeni perspective that who they're dealing with is a rabid dog that essentially can't be reasoned with, which is why I wanted to know if you could maybe talk about what Nawaf Salam and the President Joseph Aoun have been doing so far. At least from what I can tell, there are going to be direct negotiations between Lebanon and Israel for the first time in decades, maybe even ever officially, if we want to go by that standard. You spoke a little bit about this, but what was the relationship with Hezbollah like before this current stage of the war, and how has it disintegrated since the onset of this?
My understanding, which I think is the common understanding, is that there was an understanding, let's call it an understanding, if not an agreement, a kind of agreement, but certainly an understanding between Hezbollah and Joseph Aoun when he was the head of the army and was in process of becoming president of the republic, that they would work together in the sense of, yes, there would be a kind of implementation of the ceasefire and that the Hezbollah would make its concessions, but that there wouldn't be anything done by force or from behind, that it would be, hand in hand and kind of continue a relationship that, in a sense, they had, basically that they had while Aoun was head of the army. So working together rather than in opposition to each other. So that's on the one hand. With Nawaf Salam, the Hezbollah relationship was never good. And my understanding is that there's pretty much no relations or very, very little, there's not much of a dialogue going on for a while. And I don't mean this month, but for many months between the government and between Hezbollah. Although we have to remember that Hezbollah is part of the government, but let's say in terms of high level contacts between the government and Hezbollah, the organization or the political organization. So the relationship is very, very strained between now both Aoun and Hezbollah and Nawaf Salam and Hezbollah. And the relationship, as I understand it, between the president, Aoun, and Nawaf Salam itself it's not fantastic. Each one is trying in their own way to achieve something and to position themselves in a certain direction. So they're not exactly the same. They're slightly separate. And I think in some sense, people were expecting Aoun to be more of the kind of in the middle, let's say, rather than, so they're expecting Nawaf Salam to be a little bit in that position and Aoun to be more in the center and the Hezbollah to be in the other position. Aoun has now shifted more towards the Salam position, meaning that is to say more within the kind of pro-American camp as it stands now. So that's how I understand the relationship to be. In terms of the negotiation that's taking place, honestly, I think there's very, very, very little preparation. I don't think anybody knows what's going on. I think it's very, very symbolic. I think the Lebanese ambassador in the United States, who's the one who's supposed to be negotiating with the Israeli ambassador there. So it's at, basically at a very low level, let's say. I mean, in that sense. The Prime Minister, Nawaf Salam, was supposed to have traveled to the US to meet Marco Rubio. That was canceled. So it's a very kind of low level, in the end, a kind of low level direct talk. I think it's symbolic. I think it's, we started this discussion saying that the Israelis attacked Lebanon right after the ceasefire as a way for them to announce that they're not going to be bound up by the American ceasefire with Iran. I think this is the Lebanese government's way to say, we had said that we want to have direct negotiations with the Israelis. The Israelis did not respond. Now they've responded, so we're going to negotiate with them. And if there's going to be a deal of any kind of cessation of hostility or ceasefire or anything, it's going to be because we're doing it directly as the Lebanese government. So therefore representing our sovereignty, our sovereign kind of decision, rather than, we are under some kind of Iranian umbrella and we're sort of at the mercy of Iran and, Iran can sell us out or whatever it is. So I think it's a symbolic attempt to show that this is going to be a bilateral relation under American mediation and that decisions will be made in Beirut that concern Lebanon rather than in Tehran. I think that's a setup, but I don't think anything is going to happen beyond. It's certainly not now, in part because of the low level of representation, and in part because there was no preparation. There's still no real. I didn't see any declaration of objectives or main strategy or anything else so far.
I was kind of confused because this whole time, the Israeli government has been saying that the Lebanese government is incapable of controlling Hezbollah. So in what way would Salam and his government be able to control Hezbollah in any sort of agreement with the Israelis? No.
No, if anything, I would say that the Americans, I think that Trump or the Trump administration put pressure on the Israelis vis-a-vis the Lebanon fire. I think that was their way, because if you remember, effectively, the U.S., through the Pakistani mediation, and this is fairly clear, had accepted that Lebanon was part of the entire ceasefire, which is what the Iranians stipulated. And I think they accepted it. And then they, of course, Netanyahu calls Trump, and then the Americans start to, the usual thing. They start backsliding, say, well, no, Lebanon is not really part of it. And then they say, well, maybe it was, but the Lebanese government itself is saying we don't want to be part of that. And so I think they leaned on Netanyahu to say, listen, make a declaration. Just say, at least because the Lebanese government a few weeks ago said they want to have direct talks with you, you haven't even bothered to respond. So please respond. At least don't attack Beirut over these next few days. Continue in the south, but don't attack Beirut, don't embarrass the government, and let there be these initial talks, and then, we'll see what happens, but, day by day. So I think that was the arrangement. I think there was a bit of American pressure on the Israelis, at least to have the basic courtesy of responding to the Lebanese request to have direct negotiations.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems like from the US and Israeli perspective, it's been relatively effective at undermining Iranian demands on Lebanon in the negotiations. Because at least what I'm seeing coming out of the negotiations is Iran making ceasefire demands that cover Lebanon, and the US and Israelis are saying, well, what do you want us to do? The Lebanese state itself is saying that we want to handle these separately through a different diplomatic track. And so, how can we honor your demands as a separate nation over the demands of the sovereign itself? And it seems to me like an attempt by the Israelis to assert, if they're going to be forced to have a quote unquote ceasefire in Lebanon, they want the Israeli version of a ceasefire where they can maintain their freedom of action to just continue striking southern Lebanon. But the problem is that Iran, as a power, given what they've demonstrated in this war, has the cards to demand a fuller ceasefire. They actually, unlike Hezbollah in its position in 2024, unlike Hamas in its position, has the deterrent power to actually enforce a more robust ceasefire. And so it seems like an attempt to evade that, which is, to my mind, what makes it so frustrating that the Lebanese government is insisting on doing this, insisting on negotiating from a weaker posture, just so that they can take away the image of Iranian control, essentially.
Yeah, totally. I think you're right. From the Lebanese government side, their main drive is to establish, under the credentials of why they came in the first place, to say that we want to reestablish the state presence. We want to reestablish the voice of a sovereign state that has control over all the forces inside its territory. And we need to start with that. So even if it's at a symbolic level, we need to start with that. And then over time, we will be able to achieve our objectives. So if you were to say, okay, what is the best case scenario that the Lebanese government would like to achieve? They haven't stated it, but I assume this is what they would like to achieve, is first a recognition that only the state negotiates on behalf of Lebanon. Nobody does, and especially not Hezbollah does. And then secondly, that over time and through direct negotiations with American mediation, and that's obviously key. The reliance is on America, not on the Israelis. That is to say that over time, the Israelis will gradually withdraw from any occupied Lebanese land, get themselves out of then declare borders, both the maritime, reestablish the maritime borders and then land borders. And then over time, get them to stop the overflights and the drones and all of this. And maybe it takes a week, maybe it takes a month, maybe it takes a year. But I think that's how they see themselves operating. And by doing that, they'll reestablish their sovereignty. They'll reestablish the governmental will and ability and power and authority, let's say, to make all of these things. And in that process, by definition, they would be successfully disarming Hezbollah, if not by force, then by just dint of them being the legitimate authority and kind of forcing them, not necessarily through a gun, but through the force of their politics and the force of their legitimacy and the force of their own people and the people of Lebanon kind of telling Hezbollah, we no longer want to have this kind of force, and you no longer need it. We have a Lebanese army. We have an authority. We have, you can see that the Israelis are withdrawing. You can see that the Americans are putting pressure on the Israelis. So your choice is either total destruction, occupation, overflights, drones, assassinations forever, or, okay, it may take time, but we reestablish our authority. That's the best case scenario. The problem with that is, as you said, what cards does the Lebanese government have in trying to push this through? The card is Hezbollah, right? It's the ability to actually resist and inflict some kind of cost onto the Israelis and absorb these blows that are coming through. Giving this up, as they did, right? The Lebanese government, I'm not sure if we mentioned this already, but the Lebanese government at the start of this escalation of the war set out a governmental decision that declared the Hezbollah's military and security wings as basically as illegal, and told the Lebanese army to stand down from the border positions and remove themselves from these border positions, and even tasked the army with arresting anybody, i.e. Hezbollah people, that they find carrying weapons to south of the Litani River. And they've done that, by the way. They've arrested a bunch of people. So this is the position that they've taken. And by declaring them already illegal, I think that was their way to tell the Americans especially, but the Israelis, but really the Americans, that we are serious, that we are doing everything we can do and more. So please don't hit Lebanon as hard as you can hit Lebanon. Hit Hezbollah, but don't hit the rest of Lebanon, because we are doing absolutely everything we can, and we want to be able to work with you meaning the Americans, in order to achieve an objective that we all want, which is disarming Hezbollah. So there's a common objective, stated or not stated, and that is disarming Hezbollah. It's just that one wants to do it through a sense of legitimacy and authority and negotiation, and the other wants to do it by force.
And it seems like there is this very active symbol of the failure of the diplomatic track to achieve that reality on the ground, which is the UN peacekeeping force that has been on the ground in southern Lebanon for decades now. And just yesterday, it was reported that Israeli troops rammed UN peacekeeping vehicles with a tank in southern Lebanon. I think I also saw something about a UN position being vandalized. I'm not sure if you could say more about that.
They spray painted the windows of a fortification.
Right. So, I mean, on the one hand, this is just a kind of symbolic demonstration of how the Israelis might treat some legitimate diplomatic international community resolution to the issue here. But I think at least 3 UN peacekeepers have been killed in this round of fighting so far. But I was hoping that you might be able to explain for us, what are these peacekeepers doing in the South and what role are they playing in the current conflict?
Yeah, it's a big question. I've written a lot about it. Depends how far back you want to go. But effectively, the short answer, and then we can talk as much as you want about it, is that the UNIFIL, these peacekeepers, came in the first major Israeli invasion, which was in 1978. And then they stayed after the 1982 massive Israeli invasion and siege of Beirut. And the idea in 1978 was the Israelis came in and the UNIFIL was supposed to supervise their withdrawal, the withdrawal from all Lebanese territory, and then support the Lebanese government from putting its authority back into South Lebanon, because the army was not there at that point. In 1982, the Israelis come in and invade again, and then, of course, they stay in occupation until the year 2000. Now, this is the first time in peacekeeping history where you had a supposed peacekeeping force that had to operate within occupied land. I mean, that's obviously doesn't make sense to have a peacekeeping unit which is there, supposed to be an interposing unit that's there just for a temporary period of time in order to allow for political solution eventually to come about through a negotiation. Here you have a force that's just there in an occupation which made no sense. But when the Israelis finally withdrew in the year 2000, or at least when the UN certified that the Israelis left in the year 2000, they were going to start winding down and leaving eventually the country until basically the 2006 war happened. And as a result of that 33-day war where Hezbollah emerges much more powerful militarily and politically, and the Israelis clearly are defeated in terms of unable to impose their objectives at the time, there was this famous resolution 1701, Security Council Resolution 1701, which any Lebanese knows about because it's almost like our constitution. And in that resolution, as far as UNIFIL is concerned, the number of UNIFIL went up a lot. It went up to a maximum of 15,000 soldiers. And the Lebanese army was also supposed to go back and deploy in the south, another 10 or 15,000 Lebanese army soldiers. And the weaponry and the equipment and the mandate was ramped up considerably. So they had a lot more power, a lot more equipment. As I said, the mandate, the patrolling, just everything that they had. And of course, it was more EU-led at that point. So after 2006, you had big contingents from the Italians and the Spanish and the French, of course. You had as well, eventually what came to be the Maritime Task Force, the MTF, which is the first ever. Again, Lebanon is always the kind of the lab for all this kind of stuff. It's the first ever maritime peacekeeping force. So we have ships that until this day remain outside of Lebanese shores. That was German-led at the time, but including Brazilian ships, and now we have Bangladeshi ships and Indonesian ships. And so, there's a bunch of different ships that are patrolling at the time from 2006 until now, presumably as a way to prevent Hezbollah arms coming via the sea. So this was one of the biggest peacekeeping forces, the longest standing peacekeeping forces. And in this last period, in 2024, they were, of course, also attacked by the Israelis. With the Trump presidency, the whole idea of peacekeeping has been kind of hit in general. And for a very long time, the Israelis have been trying to get UNIFIL to be removed from South Lebanon. They find them inconvenient, primarily because not because UNIFIL does very much beyond reports. UNIFIL reports, it surveils any movement that happens, any projectile that comes over the border, anything that happens or moves, UNIFIL records and it puts it in reports, and that becomes the legitimate kind of record keeping in a sense. And there's a kind of protection of civilians mandate that it has as well. The Israelis resent that. And so they've been trying to get rid of UNIFIL for a while. And finally, in this Trump's second presidency, and after the 2023-24 war, they finally managed to get the Security Council to pass a resolution to no longer renew UNIFIL. Every year, peacekeepers need to be renewed, and they've been renewed since 1978 every year. Finally, they stopped last year renewing it, and they said that UNIFIL basically ends at the end of 2026, and then they have a year to kind of just basically spend a year removing their equipment, decommissioning. I mean, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of equipment. They've been around for decades. So it takes a year or many months to kind of remove everybody, all the civilian staff, all the military staff, everyone else. So this is where we are. So the fact that they're being attacked now is, in 23, 24, they were being attacked, but there was an outcry, at least a little bit. And this was in the context of the Gaza genocide, where people like me, and I teach the UN, I teach peacekeeping, I teach international law. Hopeless people like me were still talking about international law, and we were talking about the UN, and, there was still this moment of, double standards of what's going on, and, I can't believe international law is not being applied. So that was the context. Now the context is that doesn't exist anymore. So the Israelis did succeed in breaking, at least for now, this notion that international law matters, that there's some liability, that there's accountability, that the fact that you can't hit hospitals, you can't hit ambulances, you can't hit peacekeeping units, you can't hit civilians. There's something called humanitarian law. All that stuff has been successfully dismantled by the Israelis through American acceptance and European, at least kind of looking the other way. Let's just at least put it like that. And, last time I spoke to somebody, a senior person at UNIFIL, they told me that we, UNIFIL, had reached the point where they are basically being told to kind of wind down a lot quicker than even the end of this year, and certainly not through 2027, because their role is no longer, they really don't have anything, they're not doing anything, and nobody's paying any attention to them. And so what is the point of them sticking around for another year after this? So the Israelis, in a very immediate sense, do not want anybody looking. They don't want any eyes. They don't want anybody saying, yes, they came through. Yes, there's drones. Yes, they attacked this village. Yes, they killed this person. They just want, somebody, some Lebanese media or some Al-Manar correspondent or somebody to say, oh yeah, you killed some villager. And the Israelis say no, and that's the end of it. Whereas if a UNIFIL report says, yes, you attacked this village. Yes, you kidnapped this person. Yes, you blew up this water supply. In the end, the UN has a voice. It has a certain impartiality, one has to admit. That carries weight, and they don't want that. So they don't want any eyes, they don't want any surveillance beyond their own. That's at the immediate thing. And then secondly, at a kind of more macro level, they want to kill the very idea that the UN should be involved in any part of not just Lebanon, but Palestine and the surrounding areas. I mean, there's peacekeepers in the Golan Heights. There's peacekeepers within 48, so along the Green Line. So they want to dismantle UNRWA. I'm sure you guys have had discussions about UNRWA and the destruction of UNRWA. This is happening. So they want to dismantle the very fabric of what the United Nations has been doing across the so-called Arab-Israeli conflict, across all these borders, which for all the people, and I used to have a lot of debates with them, all these people that would always attack the UN and say, oh, it's so useless, it's so this, it's so that. So yeah, okay. I mean, of course the history is wrapped up with colonial history. Of course the history is wrapped up with all of this. But UNRWA, for example, including in Lebanon, but, represents, it's not just that they support humanitarianly, the kind of the Palestinian camps and Palestinian refugees. It is the store of the right of return. Not in what it says, but in effect. It is, given that the rest of the world has abandoned their right of return, including the PLO itself and the PA itself has abandoned the idea of the right of return. Well, UNRWA continues as a kind of symbol of international responsibility of the right of return. And that's the reason. It's not so much the humanitarian part that the Israelis care about. It's the fact that it embodies the right of return, that's the real reason they want to kill UNRWA. Well, UNIFIL has not quite as dramatic, but a kind of similar idea that the Israelis have to withdraw from all of South Lebanon per their mandate. And they will note it and surveil it and, write this stuff down. They don't want that. They want nobody to tell them what to do beyond signing bilateral surrender agreements with all the neighbors under the overall umbrella of an America that, in essence, they've controlled for years and decades.
Yeah, and I think we've seen this broader push from the Trump administration as well in terms of trying to elevate the so-called Board of Peace basically as a UN replacement, to take away the concept of international oversight that
Absolutely.
is tied in any way to international law, and to reduce everything to a series of bi or multilateral real estate deals, essentially like the privatization of peacekeeping. So it's not surprising in a sense to see it from the Israelis or from the Americans. I think what is still shocking to me is just what the Lebanese government is thinking. Like, if this is the reality, right?
Sorry, Dylan, just to interrupt you. There was just important to point out, just based on what you're saying, that the Trump administration, remember, had proposed an economic zone along the Lebanese border, right? Something where they were to control.
Yeah.
So that goes again in line. So remove UNIFIL and put this economic zone where the Israelis and Americans basically control, and kind of you get some trickle down effect to the local southern Lebanese economy that would then become dependent on them. So that is an important thing, which they take seriously, by the way.
I wrote about this for the economic zone for The Intercept several months ago, just for people who aren't aware. There were proposals to build factories inside of Lebanon where workers from the south could go in and have a living. But the Israelis were only able to accept that under the provision that the southerners who lived in these villages where these factories were going to be built would never be allowed to return. So purely money-making, and with no people who could ever resist Israeli occupation.
Right. Like, the US and Israel make it extremely clear that what they're going for is, global total apartheid. That is like pretty obvious. I think what it still is hard for me to grasp is, given the reality of what you're talking about, UNIFIL winding down, withdrawing, who does the Lebanese government think is going to enforce any kind of an agreement that they're able to negotiate, when America is signaling very clearly that this is what they want, that that their word means nothing, right? If we take like all of their negotiations with the Iranians, and that they have fully adopted Israel.
America. They see America has a massive embassy, as you guys definitely know. I'm not sure if the audience knows, but there's the most expensive embassy ever was built in Lebanon. And what was only very recently, after a decade or whatever of building, has finally kind of been opened. It's a massive thing. The Americans with the British have a drone or whatever base in the north of Lebanon. They like Lebanon. It's a nice place to be based. If you're going to be in the region, Lebanon is a great place to be. We all know this. Diplomats love this place. All these kinds of people love this place. And there's gas, and so potential deals. And so they don't want to be based in Syria. Syria is a bit scary still, nor in Iraq, of course. So you have a situation where I think a chunk of the Lebanese elite, certainly, and those even on the popular base that are inherently against Hezbollah and that kind of project, I think they are certain that at a certain level and at a certain condition, in a certain context, the United States will protect them. But that you need to have some kind of deal with the Israelis, a minimal deal, in order to get them off their backs. So the Lebanese government and those that back them and the Lebanese elite who back them, their eyes are firmly on America, and they are convinced that they can get American protection and that Israel is just something you have to do. It's a card you have to play. It's a devil you have to deal with in order to get American protection. You can disagree with that, but I am sure that they are convinced of that.
We've touched a little bit on religious tensions and ethnic tensions, but I wanted to get some more specifics because there was an incident several days ago in which a Lebanese forces official, someone from a party that was allied with Israel during the civil war, was killed in an IDF airstrike in the eastern suburbs of Beirut in a majority Christian area. Can you talk about what the response was from the party and its supporters and what the general role has been of Maronite anti-Hezbollah actors and parties during this war?
In this attack, there was an attempt to, at the beginning, as often happens, to say, it's a kind of random building in a random place, apparently, at least from the outside. And, the idea was to say, well, these strikes, the Israelis, when they do their strikes in certain apartments, in certain areas, then there's always a Hezbollah operative of some kind or some Iranian operative here or there. It became clear that there was nobody there, that flat that supposedly they were aiming for was empty. They then said, oh, look, there's a CCTV that showed that there was somebody getting on a motorcycle just before that and was running away. And then it turned out that was a delivery. And, the Lebanese economy is run by delivery people. All the food that comes and goes is through delivery. It's that's a whole other topic, but that's an incredible thing. So it was basically a delivery guy who left. And so they kept trying to spin it in ways to say that there was some Hezbollah operative, and that was denied. And there was no, at least until now that I've seen, there's no evidence to show that there was any Hezbollah person there, any Iranian person there. And this is obviously in a Christian district, in a Christian area. I think they assassinated the guy. Frankly, that's my opinion. I think they knew who was there. There is no way on earth. This guy was the kind of main representative of the Lebanese forces in the area. There's no way they didn't know that that's where his house is. So they killed him and his wife, and I think one or two other people that were in the area as well, or sort of in and around that flat. And I think the idea was clearly to try, as they've done several different attempts, to try to create, and this is very much an old Israeli tactic that they've renewed now, which is to try to create as much as possible sectarian tension among the communities. And in this case, obviously, the Christians. They've done it in Sunni areas, but now the Christian area as well, to try to push this idea of be careful. Anybody that looks suspicious, anybody that looks, who looks Shia, whatever that means, basically, whatever you imagine a Shia to look like. And of course, that's a class issue. It's not just a sectarian thing, but it's a class sectarian issue. Basically, when you're going in London and in Washington, D.C., you hear the metro announcements, be careful. If you see something suspicious, please alert the police. I mean, it's basically that kind of thing. Look around you, become paranoid. Anybody that's a little bit strange looking, you call somebody, you either get rid of them or you call whoever your military representatives are to get rid of them. So I think they were doing this on purpose as a way to stoke sectarian problems. I think the Lebanese forces, as they went up, they tried to play this card quite strongly. And it seemed to have died down a little bit in the sense of, and when it became clear that there was no, or they couldn't prove that there was any Hezbollah or Iranian operative there, it was very difficult to kind of press that particular line, so it kind of died down a little bit. And what came up instead is that despite that, and despite the fact that there is some tension, it's not to say there's no tension, there is tension. People are scared because the Israelis are hitting areas that are supporting or in which there are displaced, of which there are many, many. But at the same time, there is a lot of solidarity. That's even in Christian areas, and certainly in Sunni areas, and in mixed areas. There's a lot of solidarity. And I'm always shocked, honestly. I'm really quite shocked that there are not more incidents, more issues. I mean, you don't hear every single day that there's massive fights going on and that there's, you hear once in a while when something happens because it's in the news and because it gets picked up on social media and some little incident that gets picked up on social media. But actually, if you were to go and count how many of these incidents relative to the number of displaced and relative to the fact that they're put in mixed communities, it's really extraordinary. So I try to think, imagine, for an American audience, imagine if, I think, maybe at least a quarter, if not a third of the Lebanese population, mostly Shia, have been displaced. American population is 400 million or so now? Imagine if 50, 60, 70, 80 million Americans from particular neighborhoods, and you know what I'm talking about, of particular race. And that's the equivalent. The race is in America is the equivalent of the sectarian things here. The class race is class sectarian here. Imagine if 60, 70, 80 million of those picked up and went into the other mixed neighborhoods or the more affluent neighborhoods, etc. Can you imagine? Could you just imagine? Can you imagine if that was Germany? Can you imagine if that was France and all the Algerians picked up and went into this, and not 1 and 2 and 10 and 100, but in the millions, in the proportional equivalent. There would be, I don't know what would happen, but the world would end overnight. I think they would nuke their own neighborhoods. So it's incredible to me that there's not more incidents, so that the level of solidarity is so much higher than the level of fighting. That does not take away from the fact that there is tension, that there is a lot of fear, and that there are certain people that want to stoke sectarian tensions. The Israelis certainly as a whole, and that's a long-standing policy, but some of the people here that want to rebalance locally and weaken Hezbollah and kind of create tension, not just among different sects, but especially between the Shia community and Hezbollah itself. And that's where they see a weak point that they've been trying to exploit for the past 2 years.
I guess I wanted to ask more about anti-Hezbollah parties, because I had seen the American ambassador to Lebanon, who is a Maronite, saying that he had spoken to the patriarch of the Maronite church, and he had said that he would try to spare Maronite villages. The Israelis had been attempting apparently to tell people in the south not to shelter Shias, but you're saying that largely people are not biting at this.
That they're not, in terms of agitation. I think, again, it's not to say that there's no fear. It's not to say that a kind of normal reaction is to say, if you bring in a refugee, call them displaced. I'm saying if you're in a different country, let's say it's a refugee. And I tell you, if you bring in a refugee, or you bring in a displaced person, or you bring in a homeless person, you are being surveilled, and we have no problem sending a missile and killing you all of you. The refugee, the displaced, the homeless guy, and you, and your entire family on top of that. It is a normal thing to be scared and to say, listen, I can't afford this. It's, I have to protect my own family. And I've seen them do it. It's not that it's just an empty threat. The Israelis do this all the time. They kill innocent people all the time. If there is a Hezbollah guy or somebody they want, they have no problem killing 10, 20, 30, 50 people to get the one guy. And that has been enabled and allowed by the US, by the West, and by all the international community. So there is a sense of fear, there is a sense of intimidation. People are frightened in that sense. That's a slightly different thing to those that have a desire, a kind of a malicious desire to create and stoke sectarian fighting within and between these communities. That's a different thing. So there's that. And what I'm saying is that if you look at it empirically, if you just look at the number of incidents, there has not been that many. I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are ones that I don't know about, etc. But I would expect to be reading every single day. It's like social media, as we know, every 5 seconds, if something happens, it comes up. So you can't hide it. There's no hiding this stuff. You just don't see it that often. While we acknowledge it, it's just not as often as I'm sure it would be in Europe or in America or any of these, or Australia or any of these other countries, frankly.
Yeah. It seems like Israel's strategy of trying to instigate civil breakdown and increase these sectarian tensions is part of its political project of increasing instability around itself, A, because they want to be surrounded by weak states, and B, because that instability gives cause to its raison d'etre of perpetual military aggression. But it also seems like there are territorial ambitions as well. Because what we're hearing now, at least from some Israelis, is less a call for the fulfillment of Security Council Resolution 1701 and the withdrawal of Hezbollah from south of the Litani, but something else entirely, namely the territorial expansion of Israel northward through conquest and ultimately through settlement of southern Lebanon. And, there have long been Israeli fantasies of greater Israel, but it does seem like the expansionist rhetoric is becoming more and more mainstream. And of course, also annexation and Israeli conquest has long been the reality for Palestine and for Palestinians for generations. But I'm curious how these particular threats are being received in Lebanon, and if you anticipate the Israelis will move seriously towards annexation in Lebanon, Syria, and potentially elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think simply based on a sort of a continuation of what we've been talking about, I think there are those in certain areas, more affluent, more Christian areas, that would say, no, the Israelis don't want to take it. They are genuinely going after the Hezbollah threat. And if there is no Hezbollah, or at least no arms, then they will withdraw. And as I said, what's the big deal if you not even normal. I don't think anybody's particularly pro-Israeli per se, frankly. They just want to end the state of being in war all the time. And as far as the way they see it, they say, look, we had the Palestinian armed presence in the 70s mostly and then 80s. That led to these invasions the Israeli invasions of 78 and especially 82. The Palestinian left, and then we end up with a Lebanese resistance, which in their minds then becomes an Iranian. The different factions coalesce, and Hezbollah becomes basically the main resistance force in the South that ends up liberating the South. So throughout the 90s until the year 2000 onwards, they say, well, this is not Lebanese, this is an Iranian presence. So now we have to deal with the Palestinians, we've had to deal with the Iranians now, and we've had to deal again with the Syrians that were controlling Lebanon, Beirut basically, and the non-South areas from the 1990s until they withdrew in the year 2005. So they're going to say, look, it's all these foreign forces that have attracted the Israelis into Lebanon. And if you remove all these foreign forces, the Iranians, the Syrians, the Palestinians, all these different ones, the Israelis will not be here. They have no reason to be here. And in fact, it would be normal that we would end up having relations with them. And again, not love, not hate, just normal relations with them. And, shared economic, whatever, gas, trade, we're on the Mediterranean, this kind of stuff, and things will be okay, or at least they will not be invading and coming into Lebanon. I think that's their basic worldview. That is very different than the worldview for those that have been under not just occupation, but insecurity, just sort of generalized insecurity, let alone occupation, because you don't even need to have been in occupation for those 20 years to have felt the threat of the Israelis. And I'm not just talking about South Lebanon. I mean, I was born in Beirut, and lived in Beirut, and I've been under threat of the Israelis my whole life. And I'm, middle class and fairly privileged, et cetera, et cetera. But, we've felt this presence and we've been in this kind of insecurity forever. I wouldn't trust the Israelis for half a second, let alone a full second. So there is a chunk of the country that has had to deal with the Israelis for a very long time. And there's a chunk of the country that has not had to deal with the Israelis in that sense. And that's, where the split, I think, is in that sense. Those that have experienced the Israelis, actually, and those that kind of, think of them in a different way, and they've not been directly invaded or attacked or, had to deal with their consequences. They're malicious and malignant and violence and settler colonialism and all the shit that comes with it. They've not had to deal with this stuff. For them, it's not necessarily that kind of aggressive thing. Whereas for them, in their worldview, the Palestinian presence caused the civil war in the 70s and 80s, in their view. The Syrians occupied Lebanon in the 90s and early 2000s. The Iranians have been occupying South Lebanon and, in their view, controlling the Lebanese state and the Lebanese government since 2004-05, right? And that the 2006 war was not a war of liberation that defeated the Israelis. It was a war in which Iran won and took over the Lebanese state. And then so if you contextualize that with what we talked about at the beginning of this podcast, which is the discussion of sovereignty and the kind of labeling and the use of the rhetoric and the practice of sovereignty, it's to say the Iranians have been running Lebanon since 2005. Before that, the Syrians were running it. Now we want to end this, and we need to end this by withdrawing the excuse for Hezbollah and therefore for Iran to be in Lebanon, and then for us to reimpose, finally, the Lebanese state and Lebanese authority across all of Lebanon. And once we do that, America will protect us and we'll have normal relations with the Israelis. And whether we normalize in the people-to-people kind of way, well, that's a different issue. But signing a treaty, signing a non-aggression pact, signing a thing that guarantees Lebanese sovereignty and territorial integrity, what the hell's wrong with that? That's their view. I think the other view, and my view, is to say, we know, and it's not just a greater Israel. So to go back to your question about greater Israel, yes, there's the discussion of greater Israel. But if you go back to 1919, the Zionist delegation to the post-World War II peace agreements, the Zionists were lobbying, and these are documents, it's not some fantasy, it's documented, where they were lobbying the British at the time to convince the French, because the British and French were partying, were dividing up the Levant. They tried to convince the British to convince the French to put the border between Palestine and Lebanon north of the Litani River. So at the Litani, but giving them the Litani and the south to Palestine, which they would still work toward to be the Jewish homeland, which would eventually become Israel. So they have been planning and plotting this. And then from the 50s and the 60s, various prime ministers, Ben-Gurion onwards, they've all been talking about South Lebanon. So it wasn't just greater, it's come in different iterations. It comes with, in 1919 onwards, the question of South Lebanon as a fertile area, agricultural land, very important for water, for the sustenance of the Israeli economy, especially for the northern part of Palestine. That was always understood and needed, which is why they always had the Lebanese, South Lebanon's water and the Litani River and the Upper Jordan River, all these areas, the watersheds that were there, which is the same river, Upper Jordan River, that they have over Syria as well, right? It's the same water sources. They want to control all of these areas for their economic kind of agricultural sustenance. Then it came the question of the security zone and buffer zone and security zone. And now we're back to the greater Israel kind of ideology. So you can come at it whichever way you want. The thread over these 100 years is that they've won South Lebanon up to the Litani River. I mean, that's clear. And there's only one way to stop them from taking that, and that has proved to be through force. The only time the Israelis have ever left occupied Arab land was when Hezbollah forced them to leave in the year 2000. That was the first time. And then since then, there's been a series of these kinds of things. And the only way the Israelis are going to leave Lebanese occupied land is through resistance as well. Now, whether that ends in a kind of agreement by the Lebanese government or the Iranians or the Martians who may come down, great. But ultimately, you cannot negotiate with Israelis, because even if you have a romantic view about them and think that they're great, and think that they are just peace-loving people who commit genocide as a hobby, they will ultimately never comply with their agreements. They will always push. It's in the nature of Zionism as a settler colony that is rooted in a kind of genocidal entity inside Palestine and an expansionist entity in the neighboring areas. And that includes Syria, that includes Lebanon, and that includes, it's going to come back to Sinai. They tried Sinai several times, including the oil resources that are there. And if anybody thinks that the Sinai is not on their to-do menu, they have no idea what they're talking about. Now, it may or may not happen. It's definitely on their to-do list. And you can imagine that. You can imagine the crisis if Egypt collapses, how difficult for the Israelis to go into parts of Sinai and say, there's going to be an Islamic this or that or the other, or the Muslim brothers are taking over, so we need to extend to have our security buffer zone into the Sinai. I mean, we've seen it 100 times. Easy to imagine. And then they're going to start saying Turkey is the patron saint of the Muslim brothers. They're already starting to say, Netanyahu gave a speech saying that Erdogan is a Nazi. And we've already kind of begun the post-Iran thing. Iran isn't even defeated yet, and they're all in the post-Iran Turkey Muslim brothers, so therefore Qatar, therefore the Muslim brothers across the Arab region and in Syria. So as long as you have Israel, you're going to have a never-ending war and conflict. And those that think they can negotiate with them, I think, just fundamentally misunderstand the way in which the Israelis work, which is why they think that by throwing themselves into the American orbit, they think they can get the Americans to help them and to get the Americans to stop the Israelis from taking over Lebanon. And that's the main position, I think, that the government, or the main context within which to understand the Lebanese government position.
Before I hand it off to Dylan for the last question here, I do want to note to listeners that the Israeli Minister of Heritage, Amichai Eliyahu, he had posted images on his Twitter account talking about seizing the Sinai, and just yesterday posted an image of Erdogan bowing to Netanyahu at Al-Aqsa after Netanyahu seizes it.
Yeah. I mean, just as you're speaking, one thing that is jumping out to me is a kind of parallelism between the conciliatory worldview that you're describing in the Arab world and in the old guard of the resistance, of having a model of US-Israel relations where the US is clearly the hegemon pulling the strings, has the capacity and even the will to restrain Israel. And what the past several years have shown us is that that is not the case. Just in the way that the kind of like Nasrallah Khamenei vision of trying to put pressure on the US to pull the strings on Israel failed in the post-October 7th period, that same shortcoming seems to be present in the logic of those who think that if they just play into the Americans, then they will constrain whatever aggression remains from the Israelis. But I did just want to close out because I know we have to wrap with a broader question that really is about Lebanon, which is, do you see a realistic path towards something like genuine sovereignty for Lebanon? And if so, what would that take to realize?
Well, you're asking an academic to talk about sovereignty. I mean, that we should leave to part 2 to get into all those details. I mean, it really depends on what you mean by sovereignty and whether we consider, has Lebanon ever been sovereign in the way that people talk about? I mean, what is sovereignty? And how many countries in the world are actually sovereign if you want to be strict about the definition of sovereignty? Not that many, right? But sovereign, I think, in the sense they mean it here, is to have your territorial integrity. In other words, no occupation at a basic physical, material level, and the decision to be able to negotiate on your own behalf and not have somebody else negotiate on your behalf. I think those are the 2 criteria that when you hear the sovereigntists or the Lebanese government talking, I think that's effectively what they mean. Do I see a pathway? I mean, I have a short answer and a longer answer. The short answer is yes. Not immediately, but yes. And that requires the Israelis to take a big cost, for them to be able to, and I don't mean in Lebanon, but sort of as a whole, in the region as a whole, they need to take a big cost. And I think this is coming, not just through questions of resistance or not, but also through the fact that, and this is really important for all the analysis that we're doing, and it's something which I think many of us understand and see, but including me, we can't quite understand the impact that it's going to have, which is that this is, I've tweeted and said that Trump is the last Israeli president in the United States. You're not going to have anymore. This American era is over. It's been since 67 and it's been since Nixon onwards or whatever, but it's really, for me, since the 1990s, since Bill Clinton onwards, where the State Department itself kind of disappears and it becomes, basically a liberal Zionist and then a hardcore Zionist kind of, you go from the Dennis Rosses and these kinds of people to Kushner and these guys who are basically Israeli assets. And, you're in a situation where that period is coming to a close. It could be tomorrow, as I said, or next week, but certainly in the next year or 2 or 3. And what's dangerous about this moment, obviously in Gaza, the genocide is the ultimate expression, but the West Bank, the ethnic cleansing that's taking place and will continue to take place, the ethnic cleansing in Lebanon or South Lebanon, what's going to happen in Syria, and that's coming. All these things that are happening, the war in Iran is kind of, is going to change the world, frankly, whatever the outcome is. All this stuff is gearing up because we've come to the end of the American empire as it has been over many decades. And it's not just that, this question of bipolar, multipolar, China, not China. It's also the question of, in a very immediate sense, the Israelis have Zionists and Israel as a state has always depended on the great power, the UK and then America. It is no longer going to enjoy this American support as it has relied on implicitly and without any form of doubt. When Netanyahu shows up and basically dictates policy, and his minions from AIPAC onwards kind of control Congress, we're coming to the end of this. We are coming to the end of this era. And this will have incredible ramifications. It's not to say, America is going to become a radical leftist, pro-Palestine, anti-Zionist state. No, it's just going to revert to a kind of normal, what is our interest, what's not our interest, and we're not going to join wars that are, we're not going to just throw money away that we don't have, things like that. They're just going to rebalance. And what's dangerous about this moment is that Netanyahu understands this full well.
Yep.
And so the genocide that's taking place, the ethnic cleansing that's taking place, these attacks in Lebanon, in Syria, on Iran, all of this is taking place because they know this is the last big moment that they have where they can get away with it, scot-free, as they see it in any case. And so the question is, there needs to be enough of a resistance at any level, whether it's military or other kind of resistance, to stop the Israelis from achieving their objectives. And in that sense, strategically speaking, again, not normatively, it's not what I like, what I don't like. Do I like the Iranian regime? Do I not like the Iranian regime? Do I want Iran to win or not? It is simply factual that Iran stands now in the way of an Israeli domination, which will allow them to become a great power, not just in the region, but if they control the Gulf directly, basically. This means war with Turkey eventually, and it means It means, total submission in our entire area. And this would be horrendous for all of us, horrendous news for all of us here. And so there needs to be a settlement eventually where the United States understands that it's lost the war in Iran, strategically speaking. It needs to accept it, and it needs to be able to deal with Iran. And dealing with Iran means having a regional settlement in which Israel does not dominate. And if Israel does not dominate, then it can't dictate Lebanon or Syria or these other places. And you end up with a new dynamic that will be spread. I think this is what's riding on this regional war that's taking place today. And let's see how it goes. So I'm a little bit more optimistic longer term than I am in the short term. I don't see the violence ending anytime soon, but I do see the Israeli project coming in its final stages, violent as it is, but into its final stages.
Thank you, Dr. Makdisi.
Thank you.